Okay, thank you everybody for joining us for today's Wild Chat webinar. Just a few house rules before we get started. If you have any questions that you think of during the presentation, feel free to type them in the Q&A box. I know that Zoom does have a raise your hand function, but we won't be monitoring that. So best just to type your questions. Cool, so we're now at 11 o'clock, so let's get started, shall we? Okay, so today we're going to be talking about getting to know our South Africa's national bird, the blue crane. My name's Christie Craig, and my position at the EWT is as a PhD candidate and Western Cape Field Officer. And joining me today is Bradley Gibbons, who is a field officer up in the Highveld. And he's also spent a number of years working in the Karoo on blue cranes, so I've asked him to join today to help out with some of the questions. He's had many, many years working with cranes and has some great expertise. So for the duration of my PhD, I am based at the Fitzpatrick Institute, which is at the University of Cape Town. And this work is supported by the Leiden Conservation Foundation. So Bradley and I work within a group at the African Crane, at the EWT, called the African Crane Conservation Program. And we're one of the bigger programs. We've got just under 30 staff spread throughout Africa, working on conserving cranes with a special focus on wetlands and working with communities. So we get 4 crane species that breed within Africa, that being the wattled crane, the black-crowned crane, the grey-crowned crane, and the blue crane, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So for those of you who missed it, my colleague Laura Jordan gave a really great presentation a couple of weeks back, giving a nice overview of cranes, their biology and the history of cranes. So go have a look at our YouTube channel if you'd like to catch up on that. So the blue crane stands at just over 1 meter, and they have these beautiful bulbous curved heads, and these what look like tail feathers. These are elongated feathers, but they're actually part of the wing. So you can see in that picture over there, it's actually the last couple of wing feathers that you see when you see these long black feathers. So I'm just going to go through kind of the year in the life of a blue crane. So blue cranes are monogamous breeders. So from about September, they start to pair off and they start doing some courtship displays, and then they start defending a territory. So I thought I'd just share this video here of a courtship display that Bradley and I witnessed in the Karoo. And you can see the one crane is going to pick up a stick.
That's awesome.
So this is the kind of behavior that you'll see at the beginning of the breeding season, which is usually around September, October. And they do some beautiful dances together. And then a couple of months, about a month or so later, you'll probably go and check the site and you'll find that they have started to nest. So nest is a strong word when it comes to blue cranes because they don't actually build a nest. Sometimes, as in the top left there, they'll pull together some sheep dung or a few rocks, but often they'll just lay directly on the ground. They typically lay 2 eggs. And with laying eggs on the ground, this does come with some risks. So in the bottom right there, that's a crane that nested right next to a dam. And there you can see the evidence, some cattle in the camp. And unfortunately, this nest got trampled. So this kind of nest does come with risks. They incubate for about 30 days, and then the hatchlings will hatch. They usually hatch 2 hatchlings, but sometimes 1. And then as they grow, they develop these red rufusy heads. And this chick, I would estimate to be about a month old. And then as they grow older, the heads get a little bit whiter. They lose that rufous color on the head. And then at about 10 to 11 weeks, so around about the same height as the adult. So what you can see here is the adult in the center and her 2 chicks either side of her. They don't always raise 2 chicks. Sometimes they'll just raise 1, and sometimes they aren't able to raise any. But you can see the difference there in the adult and the chick. The chick doesn't have that long tertial feathers, and they also don't have that distinctive bulbous head that the adults have. This is just a slightly older chick. This one would definitely be able to fly at this point. And you can see the difference there in the lack of the tertial feathers. So this, typically the end of the breeding season will be about May. And then from about May, June, you'll start seeing cranes congregating together in flocks. So over the winter, you'll often see big flocks of cranes, can be up to several hundred at a time. And another time that cranes like to flock together is to sleep. So blue cranes like to roost in shallow wetland areas or in a shallow dam like this one here. So I'm just going to show you this video clip of a roost site near Swellen Dam. It's one of the bigger roost sites. I saw several hundred cranes coming in here the evening that I sat here. That's what you're hearing there is a blue crane call. So just in terms of distribution, so blue cranes are what we call a near endemic. Almost all blue cranes occur within South Africa. There is a very small population around the Etosha Pan in Namibia, which is isolated from the South African population. They don't mix. This population has been declining fairly steadily, and the last estimate we have was about 32 blue cranes. So when we talk about the blue crane range, we're very much referring to the South African range. So in South Africa, we can split the blue crane population into 3 subpopulations. So we've got the Eastern Grassland, the Karoo, and then the Western Cape. So I just want to quickly explain what this map is showing you. So this map is taken from the South African Bird Atlasing Project's data. And how this works is that you have a geographic unit, the pentide, and anybody who's interested in birds can go out and go into this area, and you basically record all species that you see in order for a minimum of 2 hours. And then people submit the data. So this is an amazing data source for these kind of projects. And so what you're seeing in the legend is the reporting rates. So where you see 0.1 to 2.5, that's saying that blue crane are reported in less than 2.5% of cards submitted. So what we expect is that reporting rates will go up if the species is more common in that area. So what you can see is the darker colors in the Western Cape. Blue cranes are typically a lot more common in the Western Cape, whereas in the grasslands, they're a lot less common. And this is interesting because Historically, the grasslands was the stronghold for the blue crane, but this is no longer the case. They declined quite significantly due to agriculture and grassland degradation. But interestingly, at much the same time, blue cranes started to move into the Western Cape. Blue cranes didn't historically occur in the Western Cape, but because of agriculture, they started to move in and increased quite substantially. So blue cranes are listed as vulnerable on the IUCN list due to the declines in the grasslands that I mentioned. So those of you not familiar with the red list, it's basically a way of categorizing species according to how endangered they are. So the categories typically are from extinct in the wild, where there's no wild populations, but there might be a zoo population, particularly endangered, vulnerable, which is what blue cranes are, near threatened, and then least concern. So this is a map that talks to what I was describing to you about the declines of blue cranes in the grasslands and the increases in the Western Cape. So this map is basically comparing two time periods of the South African Bird Atlasing project. And this is a method that was devised by Sally Hofmeyer and some of the other staff at the Animal Demography Unit. And she's very kindly given me the code so that I could update it. So this is comparing data up until about 2 weeks ago. So there's been two suburb projects. The first one ran from 1987 until 1991, and the second one from 2007, and it's ongoing. So what this map is doing is it is comparing suburb 1 to suburb 2, and then the color code is according to how strong the difference between the reporting rates was. So for the squares that are red and orange, that's indicating that there's been a significant decline in reporting rate between suburb 1 and suburb 2. And the squares that are blue or dark green are indicating a significant increase between suburb 1 and suburb 2. So that's quite a nice way to visualize the declines in the grasslands versus the increase in the Western Cape. And for the most part, the Karoo has been pretty stable with increases or decreases in some places, but mostly quite stable. So the focus of my work is in the Western Cape, so I'm just going to talk a little bit more about this Western Cape population. So I mentioned that blue cranes moved into the Western Cape because of agriculture. So historically, tall fynbos renosterveld type vegetation wouldn't have been very suitable for blue cranes. But as people started clearing the fynbos and started planting crops such as wheat and barley and planted pastures such as lucerne, these artificial habitats quite resembled the grasslands that blue cranes were used to. So blue cranes started moving into the Western Cape, and as more and more fynbos was cleared, the blue crane population increased. So what you typically, this is a typical kind of landscape that you see in the Overberg and the Swartland areas of the Western Cape, is this mosaic of cereal cropping. So wheat, barley, and oats, and in between that interspersed are these planted pasture areas that are used for livestock, usually sheep. And there'll be little remnants of renosterveld in between these. And if you look really carefully, you can see a couple of blue cranes there in the middle, drinking at a pan. So this is just a bit more imagery of the landscapes that I'm talking about. The landscape changes a lot seasonally because it's a very intensively farmed landscape. So during the summer, so in terms of the crops, the wheat crops that I'm talking about will be planted from about April, May, and then harvested at the end of November. So once it's been harvested, blue cranes move into these stubble fields, and they'll feed on some of the fallen grains. But during the winter, when some of the crops are quite tall, you'll often rather see blue cranes in these lucerne pastures. So the way that they use their habitats has changed quite a lot during the year. And this just gives you a visual of the areas that I'm talking of. So the pink and pinky purpley color is indicating the extent of land that's been transformed for agriculture. So you can see it's quite extensive, which means for a blue crane, this is good news because there's quite a lot of habitat. So when I'm talking about these two areas, the Overberg is this area here east of Cape Town, and the Swartland is the area on the west coast, just north of Cape Town. So again, drawing on some citizen science data. So this is another aspect of Sally Hofmeier's work where she looked at the CAR data. It's another project out of the Animal Demography Unit. And how it works is citizen scientists can join this project, and there's a number of routes that are chosen, and people drive these routes typically twice a year, once in summer and once in winter. And there's a set methodology. And basically, people will go out and count the number of birds on these routes, which gives us some really nice data to work with. And here you're looking at the blue crane data. So you can see that there's been quite significant increases for the Swartland and the Overberg. So I'm busy working on the data since 2010, so between 2010 and 2019. And it does seem like there's been a bit of a tailing off in the Overberg, but I'm still busy working with this data to figure out what the trend has been. So I've spoken about increases in the Western Cape, but we've also seen the population in the grasslands stabilize, and some areas have started to increase. So this is largely a testament of the conservation efforts that a number of organizations have put in with blue crane. So this includes ringing and monitoring of blue cranes, working in collaboration with farmers to protect cranes on their land. Almost all blue cranes are residing on privately owned agricultural land. So a lot of the work of EWT and Overberg Crane Group is involved working with farmers to protect cranes. So one of the major threats to blue cranes is power lines. They're quite prone to colliding with power lines. They don't see the lines. So one of the things that can be done is to mark the power lines, and EWT has a strategic partnership with Eskom, which allows us to identify problematic power lines and put markers up, which substantially decreases the risk to blue cranes. It makes them more visible for the cranes. And obviously research is an important part of blue crane conservation and helps us to inform where our conservation efforts need to be. So that's basically what the focus of my work is looking at the research side, and my big question is looking at how viable is the blue crane population. So we've got a situation where probably more than half of all blue cranes are within the Western Cape in this very artificial transformed landscape. And the question is this viable in the long term? So some of the questions that I'm asking with my project is, what is the state of the population? What trends have we seen so far? How are the cranes breeding? What are the extent of the current threats? And what do we expect to happen in the future with blue cranes? And as I've mentioned, I'm based at the Fitzpatrick Institute, supervised by Professor Peter Ryan. And then my manager at EWT, Tanya Smith, is co-supervising on this project. So I've spoken about some of the citizen science data that we're using, but we've also been collecting some of our own data through aerial surveys, going out to go and count cranes in the Overberg and the Swartland. And this is a big thanks to Batteliers who've been supporting us with this, and also a big thank you to Mark Rule, who's been flying us for these flights. So this is just an example of the data that we got from our winter survey. So the black lines there are the flight tracks from the GPS when we were flying. And those blue dots indicate where we saw blue cranes. And as you will remember, I said that during the winter, we typically find blue cranes in flocks. So the bigger the blue dot, that indicates the bigger the flock. So you can see we saw flocks up to 106 birds. And typically blue crane density is a bit higher in the Overberg than the Swartland. Another part of assessing the state of the population is to understand how well they're breeding. So part of my work is monitoring the breeding of blue cranes. So I'll go out roughly monthly and check on how the breeding pairs are getting along and how many chicks they're managing to raise. Quite a big focus of my project is focused on the impact of power lines. We think it's probably the main threat to blue cranes. And ESCOM has been supporting some of our work surveying power lines in the Karoo and the Western Cape, just trying to assess the threat and trying to understand what the drivers of this threat are. Another part of my work is looking at the movements of blue crane and how they're using these agricultural landscapes. So one of the ways that we can assess movement is through ringing. So there's been quite a big ringing project in the Western Cape. Blue cranes are typically fitted with a combination of 4 or 5 color rings, which makes the bird individually recognizable. So you can go out and find this crane again, and then you know that it's moved from A to B. And a master's student a couple of years back had a look at this data. And this is just a map showing some of the longer movements for blue cranes. So you can see their movements are quite regional. They don't move a great deal. But obviously with ringing data, this is a fairly sparse data. It doesn't give you a very fine scale look at how cranes are moving. So an approach that we are taking is looking at using technology, so satellite tracking devices to monitor the movements of blue cranes. So basically how these satellite trackers work is they have a little solar panel and it's the tracker takes a GPS location and the date and sends it through the cell phone network. So the tracker's got a SIM card in it. And then we can receive that data from the cranes. So far we've fitted 25 chicks with these devices in the Karoo and the Western Cape. And we're hoping to fit some more on adults this year to look at how the adults move. And how we capture blue crane chicks is basically we try and capture them before they can fly. So we just got to run and catch them. We put the trackers on, the rings on, and then we release them. And this is just an example of some data that we've got from one in the Swartland. So there's the crane there. I went out and found him or her, I'm not sure, in March this year. And you can see this crane is just over a year old and it's developed those beautiful long tertial feathers. And you'll see on the left leg is the tracker, a very small little box with a solar panel. On the other leg, he's got some colorings, just so that you can recognize it in the field afterwards. So I'm just going to play this animation quickly that shows you how it's moved. We've ringed it just north of Malmesbury, and then it's moved around a bit towards Tulbach. And at the moment, it's just north of Piketberg. So the last part of my project focuses on trying to understand the agricultural landscape. So some of our concerns with cranes being very dependent on this agricultural landscape is that certain factors may influence agriculture, for example, climate change or other socioeconomic factors. and the landscape may change in ways that could be beneficial to cranes, but may also be detrimental. So the other part of my project is trying to understand this agricultural landscape and try and understand how it might change and what this means for cranes. So one of the approaches that we've been taking is Bradley and I have been interviewing farmers about their thoughts on climate change adaptation and some of their thoughts on the direction of agriculture in the Western Cape. And then we're going to be using this knowledge to try and have a look at some scenarios for blue cranes in the future. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A box, and Bradley and I will do our best to answer them.
Thanks, Christie. Just to start with the questions, thanks so much for that, Christie, all the different information we've given there. So please continue giving some questions. I'm going to start off now with Matthew's question, and that's about genetic diversity. The first question, has the level of genetic diversity been measured among these populations? And how much divergence is there among South African populations, and how much between the South African and Namibian populations? I like that question because I still remember seeing the first map of blue cranes and seeing this isolated population in Etosha Pan, which is probably about what, over 1,000 kilometers away from the nearest crane. It was actually a study done by Namibian Crane Working Group in the past, and they showed very little significance between the two populations. But there's also currently a study underway now by University of Pretoria together with a lady called Claire, who's doing research on the genetic diversity at the moment. So that's still a question we're looking at, but just to give an idea that to present, we haven't seen much significant difference between the populations. Eleanor Mary, thanks for your question. Would the timing of agricultural activities interfere with the breeding timing of the cranes? And apart from the danger of cattle damaging the eggs, what else would pose a danger for the crane eggs? So that's actually a nice question for the Western Cape, because what happens there, that's why it's very favorable for the blue crane population, because in the summertime, which is the breeding time of the blue cranes, there's not much activity happening because you have pretty much the wheat stubble, the canola stubble lying there. So the lands are basically vacant from people and different infrastructure going through the lands. So that's perfect for the Western Cape. And generally in the Karoo as well, I mean, it's also not going to interfere the cranes at all. So that's also very beneficial. And in the grassland, for example, in the wintertime, the birds form flocks, which is then also the time of the year that the cranes won't be going into, to breeding. So it's the opposite in that case, where the breeding time is when the grasslands are being used by the cranes to breed in, but then wintertime they move into, a lot of them move into lands. Damaging the eggs, I'd probably say the next danger I've seen is actually people driving. Some people will drive quad bikes in different areas and not be aware of it. So in most cases, accidental. But we do urge people to refrain from, riding motorbikes and quad bikes as much as possible in the grasslands, for example. But I haven't seen any other threats besides livestock damaging the eggs from my point of view. And Eleanor Mary, your next question, are insecticides in agricultural land a problem? At this stage, we do have poisoning cases. Most of it is actually deliberate, or if it accidental, means that people have used the wrong mixture of poisons, which is possible. So I don't see it as much of a problem. It is usually very well monitored by different companies that do release the poisons into the system, that they do almost say like environmentally friendly insecticides for that. So, but we do have poisoning happening, and most of the time is actually targeting other bird species or other animals in some cases too. And Dominic, your question, what is the relationship between the farmers and the blue cranes, and are they regarded as a pest? I must say I'm very, very thankful for the support we get from farmers. I must say when I travel in the Western Cape as well, just the farmers love the cranes. It's been fantastic to work with those people. The Karoo, it's always a pleasure to work with the farmers in the Karoo. It's almost like like a privilege for the farmers to have cranes on their farms. They're very, very proud of it. And that's something that I really appreciate. In the grasslands, the same story when I'm working in the grassland region. I mean, just the the way that people on farms regard them as almost like a treasure to be on the farm. So I'm very grateful for that. Regarding as a pest, we are also going to conduct different tests for some people that do complain about large flocks, but generally no, not regarded as a pest. And many your other species of geese, for example, many of them are regarded as pests. Your shame, the poor Egyptian geese get a lot of blame for some damage to crops, and as well as your spurring geese. But yeah, cranes, we are also doing research on that. We're going to also, where there are problems, we will look into that. So luckily at the moment, no, not regarded as pests. And Lester, your question, do the blue cranes we've seen in the northern provinces in summer migrate to the Southern Cape in winter? No, they don't. What we call blue cranes is local migrants. So they do have generally local movements between their breeding sites and their winter sites. You'll have a group of what we call a bachelor flock that can also move around throughout the year. So that's usually a group by 20, but your large flocks can probably be like 200, 300 birds flying around, but that's generally like about 50 kilometers away from their breeding sites. So local migrants would be the best way to answer that question. Letitia, I hope I got your pronunciation of name right there. Why do you think the crane occurrence dropped severely from the northeastern parts of South Africa since the 2012 survey, and any possibility that they simply moved to the Southern and Western Cape? I think with Christie's study of the satellite trackers, we get a better understanding where they're moving to. So I am not aware of any birds moving as far down south as the Western Cape from different grassland populations. So also pretty much like the previous question, very much local migrants that they will go not too far from their breeding sites. And why do you think the crane occurrence dropped severely? Whew, I wish I knew the answer to that question. I think what's happening now, a lot of habitat change is really affecting a lot of the birds in many cases as a big threat. So we also don't know if the birds are moving to other areas. That's through our studies in the regions to see if they are maybe moving into new parts of the grasslands. Next question by Matthew, do snakes pose a threat in terms of egg predation? Phew, I don't know, I've never seen that happen. I think with the size of the eggs is relatively big enough for safety for that. I don't know if Christy, have you ever seen any snakes in your reports of snakes? But no, I think the way that the cranes also defend their nests as well as their chicks is actually remarkable. The way that they will attack what they can find as a possible threat. So I don't know if any eggs been taken by snakes, I'm afraid not. So that question I'm not too sure of. And are there any more questions? And please, you're welcome to contact us on our email addresses. And for any questions in the future, very welcome for that, for any more information. So I don't see any more questions coming through. So please, if you've got any more questions, you're welcome to contact us. And I really do thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure having you guys. And if there are any last questions, just please send them through right now. And I still see no questions coming through. So thank you so much, everybody. And I hope you guys are all staying safe. And like I say, please, if you guys have any more information to share with us or any more questions, please don't hesitate to contact us. We're always available on email and we'll get back to you on that. So from my side, thank you so much. And Christy, we'd like to end off.
Great, thanks so much, Bradley. And thanks so much for joining us today and for all your questions. As Bradley said, you're welcome to contact us at any time on our email. Yeah, thank you. Keep safe.
Bye, everybody.